up guys, welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this video I'm going to be building an awesome budget gaming PC for 2022, showing that even in the current GPU crisis you can get going in some of your favourite titles at a price point that doesn't break the bank. In this video I'll be guiding you through all the component choices, the build process step by step, and then setting the PC up, configuring BIOS settings, installing Windows, and then playing some games to test out the performance muscle of this budget-oriented system. Let's do this! When it comes to building a budget system, it can be confusing to know where to start. The current GPU crisis makes it difficult to pick up good gaming hardware at an affordable price point, and that's where this comes in. This right here is the AMD Ryzen 5 5600G. It looks like a humble CPU, but don't be mistaken. This is actually an APU, combining the power of budget GPUs and budget CPUs into one well-refined package. It gives you great gaming performance in esports titles particularly, the likes of Valorant and Apex Legends spring to mind, while also providing great upgrade paths, acting as a fantastic standalone CPU once GPUs return back to more normal pricing and the market begins to stabilise. It makes a lot of sense for a budget system like this one, and also works with some cheaper motherboards out there like this, the Gigabyte B550M Gaming. This is a very similar board to the likes of the Gigabyte B550M DS3H, and in essence it provides a simple feature set with no extra bells and whistles that still works well. It doesn't bottleneck your CPU, it allows you to tune the speed of your memory up as well. It basically does all of the simple stuff right, without too many extra frills, dashes, or fancy additions. We're going to kick things off by installing the APU chip into the motherboard. It gets two parts out the way nice and early, and can often be the most intimidating bit for a first-time builder. But don't worry, I've got you. Go ahead and locate the golden triangle on your CPU, for us in the bottom left corner, and you want to line this up with the triangle that corresponds on your CPU socket. On this motherboard, it's in the top left-hand corner. Pull up your retention arm nice and easily. Honestly, this step is so much easier than it looks. Drop the CPU in place, and the pins on the CPU will nicely slot into the holes on the motherboard. Return your arm back down. It requires zero pressure or force, and clips lock nice and easily into place. You can do this 100 times, not going to break anything, and it works really well. This then paves the way for us to move on to the CPU cooler. One of the major advantages of a Ryzen processor is this free included stock cooler. It comes in the box with many Ryzen chips, particularly the entry-level non-overclockable SKUs, and makes a lot of sense keeping your CPU cool and not requiring you to spend any more dosh. Typically, it will come with pre-applied thermal paste, but if you've used it before or not got the installation quite right, it's not a bad idea to pop a dab of your own on. Around the size of a grain of rice, that will do us quite nicely. You've already got the backplate installed on the motherboard that you need to actually secure it down, so line up the screw holes, push your cooler on and screw it in corner by corner. Do this in a cross pattern, aka don't screw one screw all the way in and then move on to the next. Do it bit by bit, a few laps around the cooler before finishing things off by adding in the CPU fan header. This will make sure the fan spins and your PC boots without a hitch. Next up on the component hit list is the RAM or the memory. Now for this build, I've opted to pick up a 16GB kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB Pro SL. This kit right here is basically an update to the legendary Corsair RGB Pro. It's a slightly lower profile kit, which while we don't need for this build, given our low profile, small and compact stock cooler, will still be beneficial for future upgrades. We'll be installing it into the only two RAM DIMMs that we've got on this motherboard to pull back the clips on either side, line your memory up and click it into place. Repeat for as many DIMMs as you've got, just the two in our case, and that is going to do us nicely. Missed the slot there, let's try that one again. Clip it in, lovely stuff. We do, however, have one more thing we need to install into the motherboard before we get carried away and start looking at the case or the chassis choice for today's video, a personal favourite of mine, and that is the SSD or the storage. I've picked up a simple Seagate drive. This is their Barracuda series. It doesn't provide any kind of groundbreaking speeds, in the region of 3 GB a second, so still a lot faster than traditional SATA SSDs, but nothing that's going to physically set the world on fire. It is cheap though, which is what we want in this build, and a 500GB capacity for those of you playing in less titles will save you some money and help to keep in this build's budget. Latest pricing and availability though, as always, can be found at the affiliate links in the description below. Now for this build, we've got one simple M.2 slot at the top, so bear that in mind. It does hinder upgradability very slightly, but not too much of an issue. You still get the SATA drives for mass storage. It does help if you install it in sort of a 45-degree angle, releases the pressure on the socket on the motherboard, and then we can secure the drive down with one of the included small M.2 screws. Lovely stuff. Once we've done that, we can move on to the case. Now for this build, I've gone for the Citadel Kolink Glass SE. Now this right here is a beautiful looking chassis. Like, I really mean it. When we first built a system in this, we got it booted up for a sponsored video actually. I was like, whoa, I'm going to use this again. Kolink have got no idea. Now, if you're in the UK, I'll pop some eBuyer and Amazon where to buy links below. In the US, you might have more trouble getting a hold of this, so I'll pop some good alternative choices. And heck, maybe even take a look at our new top 10 cases to buy in 2022. Shameless plug right there. This has got good airflow though, nice bit of tempered glass at the front and a great value price point, important for a build like this. You could go cheaper, but do so at your peril and make sure you get a case with good reviews, good airflow, and some nice aesthetics, because otherwise, what's the point? The best course of action with any case is to go ahead and remove as many of the case's side panels as you can early on. When we come to actually install the motherboard or a GPU or a power supply, it helps to have as much of the case accessible as possible. This case doesn't have any fancy thumb screws or anything like that, but it does have a vertical GPU mount, which we actually leveraged in a recent video, and I'd implore you to check that out. Obviously no dedicated graphics card for this build, but definitely something to keep in mind for future upgrades later on. This system would be perfect for the likes of an RTX 3060 or a 2060 Super even, and really work well for 1080 and 1440p gaming down the line. Our current setup though is still plenty good enough, and to install the motherboard, I'm going to opt to lay the case down flat. It means we're not fighting gravity when we go to actually install it. Go ahead and pick up your motherboard first of all, and locate any of the standoff screw holes on the board itself. These are the holes that go straight through the board and are screw sized. For us today, we've simply got 6, and we need to make sure that these line up with the holes in the case. 2 at the top are fine, there's an extra one, but that's not going to be in the way, so we can keep it in. 2 across the middle also look good, and the 2 along the bottom at different heights are the perfect combo. We can then go ahead and clip in the motherboard's rear I/O shield before screwing the motherboard itself into place. All the screws you need for this stage come included in a little bag inside your case, so if you're looking for them, that's where they've gone. Nice, that's looking pretty good. And it moves us on to the final component today, the power supply. And of course, any of the power cables we need to plug in that go along with it. Now this right here is the Corsair CX650F. Truth be told, it's a little bit overkill for this build, but I figured as far as future upgrades go, it makes sense to buy a decent power supply now. Don't get me wrong, you shouldn't pick up like an 850 watt unit now, but for an extra $20 over a cheaper unit, this strikes a nice middle ground. We need to plug up a motherboard power connector to our fully modular power supply. One end, of course, the split end goes to the power supply and the other plugs up to the motherboard, like so. A SATA power cable, which powers up SATA SSDs, hard drives, or in our case, the RGB fans at the front of the chassis. This one just plugs up to one of these smaller connections above the motherboard power cable. And we also need to plug up one of these. It's a 4+4 pin CPU power connector. One end, of course, goes to the power supply just up top here, the other to the motherboard. Now, no GPU power needed to plug in here because we haven't got a graphics card, but you might want to plug it in and then cable tidy it away to keep it safe. I'll leave that decision up to you, and then we can pop the power supply in. A fan facing down orientation is what you want to go for, as this will then pull in fresh air from underneath the case. Slide it into the rear and secure it down with a number of screws. 4 specifically, one here, one here, one here, and one here. Nice and easy, and that will secure the power supply to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And once you've done that, the actual build process of this video is pretty much there. We can go ahead and plug this thing up to a monitor, get Windows installed and configure the BIOS before moving on to the gaming benchmarks portion of the video. In order to go ahead and do this, I've grabbed our system, a keyboard and a mouse. What you want to do is plug all of these in and also pick yourself up a monitor. I'll leave this MSI monitor we're using linked in the description below. Turn the power switch on the back of the PC on and then hit the power button to boot the PC up for the first time. Fans are spinning. Happy days. The RAM should soon light up, and hopefully we should very shortly get our Gigabyte BIOS appearing on our MSI monitor over to my right-hand side. Bingo, we are in. Now what we need to do is actually go down to XMP. This is the only real setting we need to concern ourselves with today, and we need to enable XMP and choose Profile 1. This should automatically detect the speed of our memory. It's actually gone slightly too quick for this Corsair kit, so I'm going to clock it down to 36.00, which is the speed just down here at the bottom. We also then need to grab ourselves a Windows 11 bootable USB stick, or Windows 10 of course if that's your preferred OS. We're going to plug this into the rear of the system, and normally I'd say change the boot priority before reloading the system, but because the drive we've got installed actually has no OS on it at all, the PC will be forced to boot into that Windows 11 bootable USB stick. Hit F10 to save and exit and select yes. The monitor will turn off and hopefully turn back on shortly into our Windows boot environment. And just like that, we are in. Now this is Windows 11, you can tell because it's got a square, not like a 3D design. We're going to select all of our language and location, English United Kingdom for me, and then hit install now. And with Windows 11, this stage can take a bit longer than before. Jump through all of your terms and conditions, and then choose the drive you want to install Windows on. We've just added our 4TB game drive to the PC so we can test out the games a bit later, and we're just going to use the M.2 SSD drive to actually pop the OS on. This next stage of the process can take 5, 10, 15 minutes depending on the speed of your SSD, the speed of course of your USB stick. And this is the bulk of the Windows 11 installation process. And then we can go ahead and do the visual part of the setup. So we can pick our country or region again for some reason, pick the keyboard layout, choose if we want to add any additionals, we don't. Give your PC a name, I'm going to call it James. Then you're going to be asked about your privacy, your tracking, asked to log in, all that good stuff. This is really, really self-explanatory, this next bit. So just jump through all of the steps. You do have to connect to a network as well. You can't bypass the network step, I don't think, on Windows 11, which is a bit disappointing. I'll rejoin you when we're in our OS, proper tongue twister there, to finish off the drivers and that sort of stuff before we actually go ahead and get gaming. And just like that, we're greeted with the quite funny Windows 11 background. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to look like. And we also can jump into our internet browser to finish off the last stages of the setup process. Now's also a pretty good time to install Google Chrome as well, if you ask me. But let's use Edge for this, just to get those drivers working and get the system primed for the games we're looking to test out. I think the only major things we need to install for this system are the AMD chipset drivers. You can just jump through to the AMD drivers and support on their website to download these, and appropriate links will be placed in the description below. Hit download now. I'm also going to jump onto the Motherboard's product page. So of course for this build it's Gigabyte's B550M Gaming. If we jump onto there, you want to head to not a driver's website but the official Gigabyte site, because then you'll make sure you don't get trapped in by bloatware or anything like that, and that should load up in a new tab. Lovely stuff. And we can jump through to the support section of the product page, scroll down once it decides to load, pick in drivers for Windows 11 64-bit, in our case or Windows 10, depending on what you're looking to go for. I should mention as well, if you need the installation media for your bootable Windows USB stick, I'll also place that in the description alongside a full tutorial. Realtek's HD audio driver is going to be good for us. The chipset one we've already gone ahead and done, but we do want the APU driver of course to make sure our APU is up and ready to go. We don't need any SATA drivers, RAID drivers. Equally, the BIOS is going to be completely fine. Any utilities you might want include the RGB Fusion software if you're plugging in RGB cables to your motherboard, or of course Gigabyte's App Center. But for us today, I think the core drivers are going to be more than good enough, and we can just jump through the installation process on these. Once we've done that though, the system's basically ready to go. We can start playing some games on it at long last. Before we do that though, I think it's about time we take a look at the system when it's all powered up with those RGB fans working in typical GeekaWhat style. I'll rejoin you in a second for the benchmarks, but first, it's time for a glam montage. With the system looking fantastic, it's finally time to make sure this PC really stacks up where it counts. the gaming performance figures. Testing out this APU is all about expectations. It's all about the games you're looking to play. And you can see this from the first title today, GTA 5. Here at 1080p normal settings, we managed to achieve more than 60 frames a second, 61 at 1080p medium, with 55 and 49 for the 90 and 99th percentiles. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, and here the frame rate was slightly lower, but still very playable for a racing title. 1080p with most of our settings tuned down a bit gave us 54 frames per second on average, with 48 and 41 for the 90 and 99th percentile results. For a racing game like this, 30 FPS or above is going to be fine. Obviously, for a first-person shooter, like the next title today, you want to get a lot closer to the 60 FPS mark wherever humanly possible. Apex Legends is that next FPS game, and it's the hardest title I'd say on the list to run today. That was reflected in the frame rates, around the 50 FPS mark. Now this may seem a little bit low, but to be not far off 60 on what is a CPU and GPU combo for about $200 is quite remarkable in the current market. And remember, this APU is a solid CPU on its own if you picked up something like a 3060 later on down the line. It's all about expectations and having a PC that can perform in the right titles. Next up is one of those right titles, Valorant, a title where the 5600G really excels. 95 frames per second on average was followed by strong 90 and 99th percentiles in the 88 and 75 region too. That's not all though, we also tested out Fortnite, and here I'm glad to report that we got over 77 FPS on average, commonly touching within the 80 FPS region and seeing some fantastic results at 1080p competitive settings, with most of the settings tuned down to low, the render distance tuned up a little bit as well, to make sure you can see those all important enemies off in the distance. Finally, we also tested out a little bit of CSGO. Here we managed to achieve 97 FPS at 1080p high settings, really pushing the boat out on this one, and the game once again looked great. If you're looking to play Cyberpunk and those really high-end titles, this isn't going to be the build for you. But for an all-out esports-oriented first-person shooter, this is going to work really nicely. With that though, that pretty much wraps it up for this one. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.